At Christmas dinner at my in-laws' house, I warned my son-in-law that borrowing $2.4 million to open 3 more stores could destroy his company. He laughed. "A broke old man like you has no right to lecture me about business," then poured his wine over my shirt. His father spat on a piece of bread, threw it at my face, and shouted, "Get out," my daughter whispered. "Dad, please don't ruin Christmas." 2 hours later, my phone rang. "Welcome to Dad Family Revenge. I'm so grateful you're here. Which city or country are you watching from? Drop your location below so we can connect." Note: this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and learning. Any resemblance to actual people or settings is purely coincidental, but the valuable message remains. The drive from my house to Jason and Emily's place in Dublin took exactly 31 minutes on a good night. I knew every pothole on Route 161, every traffic light that ran long at Sawmill Road, every stretch of highway where the speed limit dropped without warning. I had made that drive enough times to know it by feel, the way you know a route, not because you're paying attention, but because your hands already know where to turn. I pulled into their driveway just before 7. The house was lit up the way Jason liked it, every window glowing, the landscaping lights casting long shadows across the freshly sealed driveway. It was a Thursday evening in early December, cold enough that my breath fogged up the inside of the windshield before I even cut the engine. I sat there for a moment looking at the house, and I thought about what Martin had said to me on the phone the previous week. "Walt, the guarantee renewal is coming up in March. You need to decide." I had told him I'd think about it. That was not quite a lie, but it was not quite the truth either. The front door opened before I made it up the porch steps. Sophie came running out in her socks, no jacket, arms already reaching for me. She hit me at full speed and grabbed both my hands and pulled. "Grandpa Walt, you have to come see what I made. It's a turkey, but Mom says it looks like a dinosaur, and I think it looks like both." "That sounds like a masterpiece," I said. She dragged me through the front door and into the warmth of the house, and for about 30 seconds, everything was fine. Jason was in the kitchen, still in his work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked the way he always looked in his own home, like a man who expected the room to organize itself around him. He glanced over when I walked in, gave me a nod. "Hey, Walt, grab a seat. You want something to drink?" "Sure," I said. "Whatever you've got open." He reached into the cabinet above the refrigerator. Not the wine rack on the counter. Not the good cabinet near the pantry where I had seen him pull out bottles for guests. He took down a bottle I did not recognize, something with a paper label and a price sticker still on the neck. He poured it into a plastic cup, the kind Sophie used for lemonade on the back porch in July, and set it in front of me without a word. Every other glass on that table was crystal. Emily's, Jason's, the 2-place settings already laid out for after Sophie went to bed. I looked at the plastic cup. I picked it up and drank from it, and did not say a word. Emily caught my eye from across the kitchen. She looked away first. Dinner was pasta, which Sophie had requested, and the conversation moved the way it usually did at Jason's table. Jason talking, Richard joining in from the speaker on the counter, because he called during every family meal whether he was invited or not, and the rest of us filling in the spaces between their sentences. At some point I mentioned that I had seen the paperwork for the new lease Jason was considering on the Hilliard location. Emily had left it on the counter near the coffee maker, probably without thinking. I had glanced at the numbers while I was waiting for the coffee to finish. "The per square foot rate looks high for that corridor," I said. "Have you compared it against the Tuttle Crossing Strip? The traffic patterns there are more consistent year-round." Jason set his fork down. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something in the wrong language at the wrong table. "Dad," he said, and the word landed with the particular weight he gave it when he wanted to sound patient. With all due respect, you ran a small supply shop. This is a multi-location retail operation. It's a little different. From the speaker on the counter, Richard's voice came through clearly. Jason's right, Walt. Different animal entirely. I nodded. I picked up the plastic cup and took another sip. Emily stared at the serving bowl in the center of the table, like it owed her an apology. Sophie looked at me, then at her father, then back at me. She had the instinct that children develop early when they grow up inside tension, the ability to read a room without understanding it. She reached across the table and put her small hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She just left it there. I thought about Martin's question on the drive home. The guarantee renewal. March. You need to decide. I thought about the first time I had written that check 6 years ago on an afternoon in October when Emily had called me crying, saying the payroll account was $11,000 short, and Jason didn't know she was on the phone. I had not asked questions. I had called Martin before Emily finished her sentence. I thought about the warehouse in Westerville, the lease I had arranged through a contact 40% below market rate, and how Jason had stood in that empty space and told Richard it was proof that he knew how to find opportunity. I thought about a night at the Scioto Country Club 8 or 9 months ago, when Jason had introduced me to a man in a blazer with a firm handshake and said, "This is my father-in-law. He's retired, used to do construction stuff," then turned away to refill his drink before I could finish shaking the man's hand. Sophie's hand was still on mine when I pulled out of that memory. "Does it really look like a dinosaur?" I asked her. She grinned so wide her eyes disappeared. "A little bit. But I think it's still a turkey." "I think so too," I said. On the drive back to Columbus that night, the city lights blurred through the windshield, and I let myself think the thought I had been keeping at the edge of my mind all evening. Not about Jason. Not even about the money. Just this: I was 68 years old, and I was drinking from a plastic cup at my own daughter's dinner table, and no one in that house had thought to say a word about it. I did not turn on the radio. I just drove, and I let the question sit there between me and the dark. Richard had called earlier that week to remind me about Christmas dinner. 25th, Upper Arlington, 6 o'clock. Don't be late. His voice had the particular edge it got when he was certain he was doing someone a favor. I told him I would be there. I was not sure yet if that was a promise or a mistake. Christmas dinner at Richard's house had always been his production. His table, his crystal, his version of what a successful family looked like from a certain angle in a certain light. The house on Stanwyck Road in Upper Arlington was decorated the way Richard did everything, with more effort than taste, more money than restraint. There were wreaths on every window, white lights wrapped around the porch columns, and a nativity scene on the front lawn that was large enough to be visible from the end of the block. I arrived at 6 o'clock exactly. I had my coat buttoned, my hair combed, a bottle of wine in a paper bag, a decent one. Not expensive, just decent. I rang the bell because I had never been given a key to this house and had never asked for one. Richard opened the door. He stuck his hand out, and I took it. His grip was firm in the way of men who have spent their lives believing that a handshake says something important about a person. Then he pulled his hand back, and without pausing, without looking at me, lifted the linen napkin from his shoulder and wiped his palm against it. One clean motion. Right in front of me. Right in front of the 2 relatives standing in the hallway behind him. Nobody said anything. I stepped inside. The dining room table seated 12 and was set for 11. I found my place, the chair at the far end, closest to the window that faced the side yard. I pulled it out and discovered there was no seat cushion. Every other chair had one. Mine was bare wood. I adjusted my posture and sat down. Across the table, Jason was already in full form. He had a glass of red in one hand and the attention of the room in the other. His shirt was pressed. His cufflinks were silver, and he had the particular energy of a man who had been waiting all week to say what he was about to say. His eyes moved around the table, landing on each face just long enough to confirm he had an audience. He started with the numbers which he had clearly rehearsed. Revenue projections, foot traffic studies, lease terms he had already negotiated in principle. 3 new locations, Dublin, Hilliard, Grove City, with an expected operational launch before the following summer. He spoke the way people speak when they have confused enthusiasm with analysis. I listened. I did the arithmetic in my head the way I used to do it when I was running Hayes Supply across 3 states. And a wrong number meant 30 families did not make payroll. The inventory turnover ratio he quoted was too optimistic by at least 30%. The debt service coverage on the proposed $2.4 million loan assumed revenue growth that had no basis in the current numbers. The Hilliard lease rate he mentioned was the same figure I had flagged 3 weeks earlier at Emily's kitchen table. I set down my water glass. "Jason," I said, keeping my voice level, "have you run the debt service coverage against your current cash flow? The ratio you'd need to qualify comfortably. Have you confirmed the inventory numbers support that?" The table went quiet in the way tables do when someone has said the socially wrong thing at the socially wrong moment. Jason's jaw tightened. He looked around the table slowly and then he smiled, not a warm smile but the kind that is meant to be seen. "Everybody," he said loud enough that the relatives at the other end leaned in. "My father-in-law just Googled some business terms and now he's an expert." Someone laughed. 2 people looked down at their plates. Richard raised his glass. "The boy knows what he's doing, Walt," Richard said. "Trust the process." I opened my mouth to respond. Richard cut me off before I drew breath. "You know what, Walt?" He leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had been saving this line. "The most successful thing you ever did was raise a daughter who married well." The table exhaled into nervous laughter. Emily's hand tightened on her wine glass until her knuckles went white, and she stared at the centerpiece like she was reading something written there. I looked at her. She did not look back. Jason stood up. He reached for the bottle near the centerpiece, a good red, the kind he poured for the rest of the table, and refilled his own glass. Then he walked around to where I was sitting, and before I understood what was happening, he tilted the glass and let the wine pour directly onto my shirt. Not a splash. Not an accident. A deliberate, slow pour. The cold hit me across the chest and shoulder. I felt it soaking through to my skin. "An old broke man like you," Jason said, his voice low and precise, "has no business telling me how to run mine." My heart hammered once hard against my sternum. Then it steadied. Nobody at that table moved to hand me anything. I reached for the cloth napkin beside my plate and pressed it against my shirt. My hands were steady. I was grateful for that. Then Richard stood. He picked up the bread roll from his side plate, the one he had already bitten into, and I watched him do what I watched him do, though some part of me did not believe it until it was already finished. He spit onto the bread. He threw it at my face. It hit my cheek and fell to the table. "Get out of my house," he said. My chest ached with something that was not quite pain and not quite anger. It was closer to the feeling of watching something break that you knew was fragile and had been trying for a very long time to protect. Emily pushed her chair back and came around to my side of the table. I thought for one single second, that she was coming to stand beside me. She put her hand on my shoulder and bent close and said very quietly, "Dad, please. Sophie is watching. Just go. Don't ruin Christmas." I looked at my daughter. Her eyes were wet and her jaw was set, and she was asking me to be the one who left. I folded the napkin and placed it on the table beside my plate. I stood pushed in my chair and walked to the hallway where I had hung my coat. I put it on one sleeve at a time. I picked up the wine I had brought still in its paper bag, unopened, untouched, and I carried it out the front door. As I pulled it shut behind me, I heard Jason say something to Richard. I heard Richard respond. Then I heard Jason say, clearly satisfied, "Finally." The cold air on the porch hit the wet patch on my shirt, and I stood there for a moment, breathing. The nativity scene glowed on the front lawn. One of the wise men had tipped slightly to the left, and no one had bothered to straighten him. I walked to my truck. I set the wine on the passenger seat. I started the engine and sat in the dark with the heat beginning to push through the vents, and I looked at my phone, and I found Martin's name, and I put my thumb on it. I did not press it yet. I looked back at the house, every window lit, every wreath straight, every light perfectly placed, and I understood something I had been circling for 6 years without landing on. I pressed call. Martin picked up on the second ring. "Walt." His voice was the same as it had been for 40 years, low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that most problems looked different after you stopped reacting to them. "I was wondering when you'd call. You knew I would." "I had a feeling." A pause. "How bad was it?" I turned onto the highway and let the acceleration press me back into the seat. The wine bottle on this passenger seat shifted against the door. Jason poured a drink on me. Richard threw bread at my face. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Emily told me to leave so I wouldn't ruin Christmas." Martin breathed out slowly. Not a sigh, more like a man setting something heavy down on a table. "Walt, I need you to do 3 things," I said. "Tonight, if possible. Tomorrow morning, at the latest." A beat of quiet. Then, "Tell me. Don't renew the guarantee on the expansion loan." The words came out clean, one at a time, the way I used to dictate terms in a conference room when I was running Hayes Supply, and the other side of the table needed to understand I was not negotiating. The $2.4 million. When the bank calls for confirmation, it's gone. Martin had been my accountant before he was my friend, and he had been my friend for longer than either of us could properly calculate. He did not flinch. "Done. What else?" "The Westerville warehouse lease. When it comes up for renewal in March, let it go back to market rate. No extensions, no favors, no arrangements." I watched the highway lights slide over the hood of the truck. Whatever the building is worth to them at full price is what they pay. That's going to hurt their operating margin significantly. "I know what it's going to do, Marty." Another pause. I could hear him writing something down the scratch of a pen, which was so Martin that it almost made me laugh. 70 years old and still keeping paper notes. "And the third thing, stop the referrals. The wholesale accounts I've been routing through your contacts, the furniture buyers, the commercial clients. They can find their own customers." Martin stopped writing. "Walt, if I pull all 3 of these at once." "You're not pulling the original investment," I said. "The capital stays in, the employees keep their jobs, the company doesn't collapse." I felt my chest tighten and forced my voice to stay level. "I'm not trying to destroy anything, Marty. I'm just done building something for people who think I'm furniture." The highway curved, and Columbus opened up ahead of me. The scattered lights of the suburbs bleeding into the brighter cluster of downtown, the way it always looked, coming in from the west at night. I had driven into this city for 40 years. I had built something here, sold it, and then spent the years since quietly keeping someone else afloat. And tonight, that someone had poured wine on my shirt in front of his entire family. You sure about this? Martin asked. I was sure before I called you. He accepted that. He always knew when I had already decided and when I was still working toward it. I'll make the calls first thing in the morning. The bank won't act until they hear from me directly. Jason filed the application 3 days ago, so they're mid-process. When I withdraw confirmation, the loan falls. How fast? They'll notify him within hours of opening. I pulled off the highway onto the surface streets that led toward my neighborhood. The houses here were older, smaller, set back from the road behind bare winter trees. My house was on a street where people hung their Christmas lights without worrying too much about symmetry. I had always preferred it that way. There's something else, Martin said. The bank called me this afternoon before tonight. Jason submitted the paperwork 3 days ago. They've already started processing. He stopped. Walt, he was moving fast on this. He had already lined up contractors for 2 of the 3 locations. My hand tightened on the steering wheel. He thought it was already done. He thought it was already done, Martin confirmed. I turned onto my street and pulled into the driveway. I sat with the engine running, looking at the dark front window of my house. I had put up exactly 4 strands of lights this year along the porch railing, nothing more. Emily had teased me about it at Thanksgiving. She said the house looked like it was trying, but not committing. Marty, I said. Yeah. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Morning is going to be loud. I cut the engine. The warmth died with it, and the cold came through the glass immediately, the way Ohio cold does in December. Not dramatic, just thorough. I picked up my phone and looked at the screen before going inside. No messages from Emily. No missed call asking if I had made it home safely. There was one text. Sophie sent at 8:47. Grandpa Walt. I hope you're okay. I love you. I read it twice. My throat closed around something I did not have a name for. I typed back, I'm okay, Soph. Love you too. Get some sleep. Then I went inside, sat at the kitchen table in my wet shirt, and did not move for a long time. I woke up at 5:15 without an alarm. That was nothing unusual. I had not needed an alarm clock since I sold the company. My body had its own schedule now, calibrated to nothing more demanding than the coffee maker and the morning light. I lay there for a moment, listening to the furnace run, and thought about what Martin had said the night before. Morning is going to be loud. I got up, changed out of the shirt I had apparently fallen asleep in, and started the coffee. By 6:30, I was on the back porch with a mug in both hands, looking at the garden. The tomato beds were empty and frost-hardened the way they always were in December. Sophie had helped me pull the last of the stakes in October. She had worn my work gloves, which came up to her elbows, and complained that gardening was harder than it looked. I had told her that was true of most things worth doing. Martin called at 7:04. It's done, he said before I could speak. I reached the loan officer at the bank's commercial line at 6:50, withdrew the guarantee confirmation. They flagged the application as incomplete and sent automatic notification to the borrower. He paused. Walt, the Westerville property manager, is a friend of mine. I called him last night after we spoke. He already knows the March renewal terms are changing. My chest loosened by exactly 1 notch. And the referral network. I sent messages to 3 contacts last night. Quiet messages, nothing that creates a paper trail. They understand. Another pause. Walt, I want to be clear about something. Nothing we've done violates your original partnership agreement. You were never obligated to guarantee additional loans. You were never obligated to maintain below-market lease arrangements. And the referrals were personal favors, not contractual obligations. His voice had the careful precision of a man who had spent 50 years making sure the right words were on record. You have not breached anything. I know that, Marty. I know you know. I'm saying it out loud anyway. I refilled my coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching a cardinal land on the empty tomato cage in the back corner of the yard. Bright red against the gray December morning. It looked completely out of place and completely certain of itself. How's the original investment structured? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I needed to hear it said plainly. Silent partner agreement, Martin said. You hold a minority equity stake through my firm as registered agent. The stake remains intact, regardless of what happens with the expansion loan. The company's existing operations, payroll, current leases, vendor contracts. None of that is affected by what we did last night. He paused. 43 people went to work this morning and will get their paychecks on Friday. That won't change. Good. That was the line I had drawn for myself on the drive home. The line I had needed to know I was not crossing. That's all I needed to hear. We were still on the line when my phone buzzed against the counter. I looked at the screen. Emily. My stomach dropped, not with dread exactly, with something more specific. The knowledge of what the first words out of her mouth were going to be before she said them. I'll call you back, I told Martin. I answered. Emily. Dad. Her voice was shaking, not crying, not yet, but right at the edge where shaking lives before it becomes something else. Jason and Richard just got a call from the bank. The expansion loan was denied. Their dad, they're completely... She stopped, pulled in a breath. What did you do? I stood very still at my kitchen window. The cardinal was gone. What did you do? Not are you all right? Not Dad. I'm so sorry about last night. Not how is your face? How is your shirt? How are you? After my husband poured wine on you in front of my family, and my father-in-law threw food at your head while I asked you to please just leave quietly. What did you do? I didn't take anything from them, Emily, I said. My voice came out even, which surprised me. I just stopped paying for people to disrespect me. Dad, please. Her voice cracked on the second word. Please. Just restore the guarantee. They need this. The whole expansion, the contractors are already no. A sharp intake of breath. Dad. Emily. I said her name the way I had said it when she was small and had done something she knew was wrong and was trying to talk her way around it. Not angry. Just final. No, the line stayed open. I could hear her breathing fast, shallow, the way she breathed when she was trying not to cry and losing. In the background, faint but clear, I heard Richard's voice. Tell him he has no right. And then a muffled, as though Emily had pressed the phone against her coat. She came back. I have to go. Her voice had gone flat in the way voices go when someone decides to stop feeling something for a while. I'll call you later. Okay, I said. She ended the call. I set the phone on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Then I looked out the window at the empty garden. The cardinal did not come back. I poured what was left of my coffee down the drain because it had gone cold while I was not paying attention, and I started a fresh pot, and I stood there listening to it brew, and I thought about the fact that in 31 years of being Emily's father, this was the first Christmas morning she had not called to ask if I slept well. A minute later, my phone buzzed again. Martin, I picked up. Walt, he said. I just got a very interesting call. You need to hear this. Martin had known me for over 40 years, and in all that time I had never once heard him sound the way he sounded when I called him back, like a man who had just picked up something he was not sure he wanted to be holding. Talk to me, I said. Richard called me this morning. Martin's voice was measured, but underneath it was something tighter. About 40 minutes after the bank notification went out, I didn't recognize the number. At first he called from his personal cell, not the house line. I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down. What did he want? He wanted me to restore the guarantee. Martin paused. But that's not the part you need to hear. Walt in the middle of threatening me, and he did threaten me very clearly. He said something he clearly did not realize was a confession. My hand tightened around the phone. Tell me exactly. Or he said, and I'm reading from the notes I wrote down immediately after. I heard paper moving. I knew there was money behind us. I knew it wasn't coming from nowhere. I just didn't know it was Walt's money until now. Martin stopped. Walt, he knew. For years he knew someone was carrying that company. He just didn't know your name was on it. I stared at the far wall of my kitchen. There was a water stain near the ceiling I had been meaning to fix since October. I looked at it, and I felt something move through my chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief. Something in between that had no clean word attached to it. 6 years. Richard had stood in front of his son for 6 years and accepted credit for a rescue he knew he had not performed. He had let Jason look at him with that particular admiration, the admiration of a son who believes his father pulled him back from the edge, and he had said nothing to correct it. And last night, he had sat at the head of his Christmas table, thrown bread at my face, and told me to get out of his house. So what was the threat? I asked. My voice came out quieter than I expected. He said if I didn't restore the guarantee, he would make sure everyone in the Columbus business community knew what kind of games, his words, what kind of games you people play. Martin's tone sharpened on those 2 words. I told him I had no obligation to guarantee loans I hadn't agreed to renew. He called me a backstabbing accountant. Then he hung up. He threatened you, I said. He tried to. A short exhale. Walt, I've been in this business for 48 years. Richard Carter is not the most frightening man who has ever called my office angry. Despite everything, something almost like a laugh moved through me. No, I agreed. He isn't. There's more. Martin's voice shifted again, lower, more careful. I've been making some calls this morning. Discreet ones. Jason reached out to at least 2 business contacts before 9 o'clock. Told them you were another pause, another check of his notes. A bitter old man who can't stand seeing his son-in-law succeed, and that you were attempting to interfere with a legitimate business expansion out of personal resentment. The water stain on my ceiling blurred slightly. I blinked it back into focus. And Richard? I asked. Richard called at least 3 family members, told them you were trying to steal the company, that you had always resented Jason's success, and that this was your way of getting back at them. Martin let that sit for a moment. Walt, these are people who were sitting at that table last night, people who watched what happened, and they're still making these calls. I pressed my free hand flat against the kitchen table. The wood was cool under my palm. I held it there and breathed. Can they prove any of it? I asked. Prove that you're bitter and vindictive. Martin's voice was dry. No, because you're not, and there's no evidence that you are. Your original investment is still in place. The employees are still employed. The only things you've withdrawn are things you were never contractually required to provide in the first place. He paused. Walt, anyone who looks at the actual facts of this situation will see exactly what happened. And the people who don't want to look at the facts will believe what they want to believe, Martin said. That's not something I can fix. I stood up from the table and carried my phone to the back door, looking out through the glass at the frozen garden. 43 people had gone to work this morning. 43 people would get their paychecks on Friday. That was still true. I held on to that the way you hold on to a railing when the ground is uncertain. Marty, I said. There's something I need you to pull up. The Westerville lease, the original agreement from 2019. Can you send me the full document? A brief pause. I can. Why, because I want to see the signature page. Something had been sitting at the back of my mind since Martin had mentioned the lease the previous evening, a detail I had filed away and not yet fully examined. Send it to my email. The old one, not the business account. I'll do it now. I heard him pull up his computer. Walt, are you all right? I watched a sparrow land on the empty tomato cage and immediately leave again, as though it had remembered it had somewhere else to be. Ask me again tomorrow, I said. I'll have a better answer. I ended the call. 3 minutes later, my email notification chimed. I carried my phone to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened the document Martin had sent. I scrolled to the last page. I looked at the signature lines, and the thing that had been sitting quietly at the back of my mind walked forward and stood directly in front of me. My daughter's handwriting, on a line I had not known existed. My throat tightened so fast it felt like a fist closing around it. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. Long enough for the morning light to move from one side of the window to the other. Long enough for my coffee to go completely cold, and for me to drink it anyway, because getting up to reheat it felt like more effort than I could justify. Long enough to read the signature page of that lease agreement 4 times, looking at my daughter's name in her own handwriting, and understand exactly what I was seeing. Emily Ann Carter, co-signer. March 14, 2019. In Ohio, a commercial lease co-signer takes on legal responsibility for the lease obligations if the primary tenant defaults. Emily had signed that document knowing what it meant. She had always been careful about paperwork even as a girl. She did not sign things she had not read. I called Martin. You saw it, he said before I could speak. When did you find it? Last night after we hung up. I was going through the original file to confirm what documents would be affected by the lease change. His voice was careful. Walt, I should have flagged it when the arrangement was set up in 2019. It was an oversight on my part. I'm sorry. You didn't put her name there, I said. No. A pause. She signed it voluntarily. The application came through as a 2-party submission, Emily as co-signer, my firm as the principal lessee representing your investment. She was present for the signing. She knew the full structure. I pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose and held them there. She knew from the beginning. She initiated the arrangement, Walt. She called you in October 2019. She came to my office in March. She signed the document. Martin spoke carefully the way he did when he needed me to hear something, without softening it past the point of truth. She has known every detail of this for 6 years. What I felt in that moment was not anger. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was the specific airless hurt of discovering that someone you love has been carrying a secret that touched you, a secret that shaped how other people saw you, how other people treated you, and they chose to keep it rather than tell you. I thought about every dinner at Jason's table where Richard had made a comment about my truck, my house, my retirement. Every time Jason had introduced me as the man who used to do construction stuff. Every time Emily had looked at the centerpiece instead of at me. She had known what I had done for them. She had known, and she had stayed quiet while her husband poured wine on my shirt. "Martin," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. Why would Jason ask her to keep it from me specifically? I've been thinking about that. Martin took a moment. If Jason had known from the beginning that you were the investor, that your money was holding his company up. He couldn't have built the story he built about himself. The self-made businessman. The son who proved his father right. Another pause. And Emily, keeping the secret, protected that story. Every day she stayed quiet, she was choosing his version of events over yours. I stood up from the table. My legs felt unsteady in a way they almost never did anymore, not from age, but from the particular physical effect of understanding something you cannot ununderstand. I walked to the back door and opened it, stepping out onto the porch in just my flannel shirt. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and thorough, and I let it. The garden was gray and still. The tomato cages stood empty. I had built those beds 12 years ago, the summer after Margaret died, because I needed something to do with my hands during the hours I did not know what else to do with. Emily had helped me plant the first seedlings. She had been 26, still new to Columbus, not yet married. She had asked me how I knew which ones would make it, and I had told her, you don't, you just give them the right conditions and pay attention. I went back inside before I lost the feeling in my fingers. I sat back down at the table. I did not call Emily. I was not ready for that conversation, not because I was afraid of it, but because I needed to know what I wanted to say before I opened my mouth. I had learned that lesson late in life, and I was not going to unlearn it now. I took out a notepad, the yellow legal kind I kept in the kitchen drawer for grocery lists, and I wrote 3 things down. Not a plan. Just the facts as I now understood them in the order I had come to understand them. Emily knew. Emily signed. Emily stayed quiet. I looked at those 3 lines. Then I put the pen down and folded the notepad closed and put it back in the drawer. From the living room, my phone buzzed against the coffee table. I walked in and looked at the screen. Unknown number. It rang 3 times and stopped. A minute later, a text from Martin Walt. A man named Greg Patton just called my office asking for you. Says he knows you from the old Supply Combert days. Says it's important. Should I give him your number? I looked at the name. Greg Patton. I had not thought about Greg Patton in 4 years. He had been a junior accountant at my firm when I was running Hayes Supply, sharp, quiet, the kind of young man who noticed things other people walked past. I texted Martin back, give it to him. Then I sat in my armchair and waited and tried not to think about my daughter's handwriting on a document I had never been meant to see. Greg Patton called at 3:14 in the afternoon, which told me he had not wasted time after Martin gave him my number. Mr. Hayes. His voice was the same as I remembered it, younger than his face suggested, precise in the way of people who spent their careers reading numbers and had learned to apply that precision to everything else. Thank you for taking my call. I wasn't sure you would. Martin vouched for you, I said. That's enough. What's going on, Greg? A short pause. I'd rather not do this over the phone if that's all right with you. I can come to you. I know it's the day after Christmas, and I'm sorry for the intrusion, but I think you need to hear this before the week is out. I looked out the front window at the street. The neighbors' kids were taking turns on a new sled down the small slope at the end of the cul-de-sac, a hill barely worth the name, but they were making the most of it the way kids do when they've decided something is going to be fun, regardless of what the terrain thinks. How far are you? I asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. I'm already in your part of town. Then come ahead. He arrived in 19 minutes, which meant he had been closer than 20 when he called. He was wearing a dark suit jacket over a collared shirt, no tie, which was a concession to the holiday, I supposed, and he was carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. He looked older than I remembered, though I supposed we all did. He had been maybe 30 when I last saw him. He was pushing 40 now. I brought him into the kitchen, set a mug of coffee in front of him, and sat across the table. I did not offer pleasantries beyond what courtesy required. He had driven to my house on December 26th. He had not come for small talk. I heard what happened at the Christmas dinner, Greg said, wrapping both hands around the mug. Not everything, just that there was an incident. One of Richard's relatives was at that table. He and I share a client. Word got back to me this morning. It does, I agreed. What did you need to tell me? Greg set the mug down and straightened his posture in the way of someone about to say something they have been rehearsing. I want to be careful here because there are limits to what I can say. I do accounting work for a company that shares a vendor relationship with Carter Home Furnishings. That relationship gives me access to certain comparative financial data. He paused. I am not in a position to share specifics. My professional obligations don't allow that, and I want to be clear about that boundary. You understood, I said. Then tell me what you can. What I can tell you is this. He looked at me steadily. The numbers inside Carter Home Furnishings do not match the image Jason Carter has been selling. Not in minor ways, in significant ways. Ways that have been building for at least 2 years. He let that land before continuing. I'm not here to hand you ammunition, Mr. Hayes. I'm here because you apparently did something last night that a lot of people in this city have wanted to do for a while, and because I think you deserve to know that whatever you suspected about that company's finances, you're not wrong. My jaw tightened. 2 years. That tracked with what I knew with the Audi lease, the country club membership, the client entertainment expenses that had struck me as inflated the one time Martin had flagged them in passing. How long have you known? I asked. Greg's expression shifted, not guilt exactly, but the look of a man who had been carrying something uncomfortable and had run out of comfortable places to put it. Long enough that I should have said something sooner. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't have the full picture, that maybe there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. He exhaled through his nose. Then I heard what happened to you at that dinner table. And I thought if Walt Hayes is getting wine thrown on him while he's trying to save that man from his own bad math, the least I can do is drive 20 minutes. Something cracked loose in my chest. Not dramatically, not the way things break in movies with noise and falling. More like a seam giving way quietly after too much pressure. I looked down at my hands on the table and I took a breath that was steadier than I felt. I appreciate that, I said. I mean it. I know you do. Greg picked up his coffee again. There's one more thing. Jason has been telling people in the business community that you're trying to steal his company. Richard Carter has been calling people family associates, saying the same thing. He held my gaze. I've heard it from 3 separate sources in the last 8 hours. I want you to know that not everyone is buying it. People who have dealt with both of you professionally, they know the difference between a man protecting his investment and a man trying to destroy something. Does it matter? I asked, not bitterly, genuinely. It might, Greg said. Reputation is a long game, Mr. Hayes. You know that better than anyone. He left 20 minutes later. I stood at the front door and watched his car reverse out of the driveway, and then I stood there a moment longer in the cold air, my hand still on the doorframe. The neighbor kids had abandoned the sled hill. The street was empty and quiet under the late afternoon gray. I went inside and sat back at the kitchen table and picked up my phone. I typed a message to Emily. 4 words, tomorrow, my house 10. I did not add please. I did not add an explanation. I sent it and set the phone down and waited for her response. It came in under a minute. Okay. I'll be there. I looked at those 4 words on the screen. She had not asked why. She had not pushed back or suggested a different time or a different place. She had said okay immediately, which meant she had been waiting for me to reach out and was relieved that I had. That told me something, though I was not yet sure whether it was something that made the conversation I was preparing for easier or harder. I put the phone face down on the table and looked at the empty chair across from me. Margaret used to sit in that chair. In the last year before she got sick, we had made a habit of sitting at this table after dinner with whatever was left of the evening coffee. Sometimes a small glass of something, mostly just the comfortable weight of each other's company. She would have known exactly what to say to me right now. She always did. I missed her in the particular way that comes not from the big anniversaries or the expected moments, but from the small, precise ones. The moments when her absence is a specific shape, instead of just a general ache. I turned the phone back over. Emily's message was still on the screen. I typed one more word, "Good night." Then I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed earlier than I had in years, and lay in the dark, listening to the furnace run, and tried to figure out what I was going to say to my daughter in the morning. Emily arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. I knew she would be on time. My daughter had inherited my punctuality, which I had always considered one of the more useful things a person could pass down. She was precise when she was calm, and she was even more precise when she was not. The fact that she rang my doorbell at 9:59 and waited told me she had probably been sitting in her car at the end of the block for the last 10 minutes, working up to it. I opened the door before she knocked a second time. She looked exhausted in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been bracing for impact for so long that their muscles have forgotten how to unclench. Her coat was buttoned crooked. She had not noticed, or she had noticed, and stopped caring somewhere between her car and my front step. "Come in," I said. "Coffee's ready?" She stepped inside without speaking, which was unlike her. Emily had always filled doorways with words, even when she was small. The fact that she walked past me into the kitchen without so much as a good morning told me she was saving everything she had for what came next. I poured 2 mugs and set them on the table. I sat down. She sat across from me, the same chair Greg Patton had used the day before, the same chair Margaret had used for 30 years before that. I let her wrap her hands around the mug and take one drink before I said anything. "I know about the lease, Emily." Her hands tightened on the mug. The knuckles went white in a line across her fingers. She did not look up immediately. She stared into the coffee for a moment, with the look of someone who had known a specific door was coming, and had still flinched when it opened. "Martin sent you the file," she said. "He did." She raised her eyes to mine. They were red at the edges, not from crying, from the effort of not crying, which is a different kind of red entirely. "How long have you known?" "Since yesterday morning." I kept my voice level. "I want to hear it from you, Emily. All of it. From the beginning." She set the mug down carefully, like she needed to do something careful with her hands. "Dad, Her voice broke on the second word, and she pressed her lips together hard and breathed through her nose for a moment. Then she started again. "6 years ago, when Carter Home was going under, I called you because I had no one else to call. Jason didn't know I was calling you. He thought I was talking to Susan, my college roommate. She called every Sunday, so he never questioned it." "I remember," I said. "After you set everything up through Martin, after the money was in place and the warehouse deal was done, things stabilized fast. Faster than Jason expected." She curled both hands around the mug again. "About 2 years in, Jason started asking questions. About the investor. About why the lease terms on Westerville were so far below market. He's not stupid, Dad. He started pulling threads. And he found me. He found Martin's firm first. He pushed until he figured out who was behind the firm." Her voice had gone quieter, lower, like she was rationing the air it took to say this. "He came to me one night. Sophie was 4, she was already asleep, and he sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and he told me he knew it was you. And he told me that if I ever confirmed it to anyone, to you, to his father, to anyone, he would make sure I regretted it." My chest tightened around something hot and hard. Define regret. Emily's jaw worked. He said the lease co-signer document I had signed gave him grounds to claim I had entered into financial arrangements without his knowledge or consent. He said if we ever divorced, his word not mine, he brought up divorce like it was already something he was considering. He would use it to argue I was financially reckless. That no judge would give primary custody to a mother who signed commercial leases behind her husband's back. She looked at me directly now, and her eyes were bright with tears she was refusing to let fall. He said he would fight for Sophie. Full custody. The word full landed in the room like something dropped from a height. I did not speak right away. I looked at my daughter across the table, this woman who had grown up in this house, who had helped me plant tomatoes in the backyard, and learned to drive in the church parking lot 3 blocks east, and called me the night she got engaged because she wanted to tell me before anyone else. And I understood something I had been trying not to understand since I saw her name on that lease. She had not stayed quiet because she did not love me. She had stayed quiet because she loved Sophie more than she was afraid of anything else in the world. That was not a betrayal. That was a mother. It did not make Christmas dinner hurt less, but it made it make sense in a way it had not before. How long has he controlled the accounts? I asked. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraping against something in my throat. Since before Sophie was born. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper now. He put his name as primary on everything after we got married. I had an allowance, basically. A monthly transfer to my personal account for household expenses. Everything else went through him. And you couldn't leave. I couldn't leave without money, without proof of anything, and with him holding that lease document over my head. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, holding herself together by what looked like sheer force of will. Dad, I am so sorry. For the dinner. For all of it. For standing there and telling you to go instead of... Her voice broke fully this time, and she stopped talking and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. Emily. She looked up. Her eyes were spilling over now, quiet tears, the kind that come after you've been holding them back too long. Tell me about the account at Huntington. She blinked. How did you... You mentioned needing to talk about something other than the loan when you texted me last night. And I know my daughter. I kept my hand on hers. Tell me. For the first time since she had walked through my front door, something in her face shifted. The bracing eased just slightly, like a door opening a crack toward somewhere warmer. I've been saving for 3 years, she said. Small amounts, things he didn't track closely. I opened the account 8 months ago. I have enough to get through 90 days if I need to. And a lawyer? I called one last week. She straightened her spine, a small movement, but deliberate. I haven't filed anything, but I know where I stand. I squeezed her hand once and let go. I picked up my coffee. She picked up hers. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table where her mother used to sit, and I thought about the fact that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do takes 3 years and happens in amounts so small that nobody notices until the sum is large enough to matter. Good, I said. That's good, Emily. Outside the kitchen window, a cardinal landed on the empty tomato cage, the same one or one like it, bright red against the gray December sky. Emily saw it too. Her breath caught. Mom used to say those were good luck, she said softly. She did. I agreed. I did not tell Emily I had been watching that cardinal for 2 days and that it had not felt particularly lucky yet. Some things you keep to yourself. Now finish your coffee, I said, and then I want you to tell me everything starting with the envelope you've been keeping for 8 months. Her chin lifted. Her shoulders squared, and for the first time she looked less like someone bracing for a blow and more like someone who had finally decided to throw one. Before I show you what Emily had been hiding in that envelope for 8 months, I need to pause for just a second. Drop "still here" in the comments right now so I know you are with me. Because what comes out of that envelope next will change everything you thought you knew about Jason Carter's success. This story contains fictional elements crafted to inspire reflection. If that is not for you, no hard feelings, step away now. But if you are staying, let's keep going. Emily went into the hallway and came back with a manila envelope she had been carrying inside her coat. Not a purse. Her coat. She had kept it against her body the whole drive over, which told me she had been afraid of losing it, or afraid of losing her nerve about it, before she got through my front door. She set it on the table between us. It was thick enough that the metal clasp strained slightly at the top. 8 months of paper folded and organized, carried in a coat pocket like a secret she had been waiting to hand to someone. I started taking photos in April, she said. Whenever he left his laptop open, whenever he printed something and left it on the desk. I used my phone. Then I printed copies at the library on Saturdays when I told him I was taking Sophie to story time. She pressed 2 fingers flat against the envelope. Sophie actually loves story time. I didn't lie about that part. Tell me what's in it, I said. Emily opened the clasp and pulled the papers out in a stack. She did not hand them to me immediately. She squared the edges against the table the way someone does when they need an extra 3 seconds to commit to something they have already decided. Audi Q8, she said. Lease payments. $1,847 a month charged directly to the Carter Home Furnishings operating account. 24 months. She laid the first set of papers in front of me. He told me the company needed it for client meetings. He drove it to his golf games. I looked at the figures. The payments were categorized under vehicle and transportation, which was technically a legitimate business expense category, until you looked at the mileage logs beside them, which showed the car spent more time at the Scioto Country Club and a steakhouse on Polaris Parkway than at any client location. Scioto Country Club. Emily continued placing the next set down. Annual membership. $8,400 billed as client entertainment. Renewed twice. She looked up at me. He took Richard there, Dad. Not clients. His father every Sunday. My jaw tightened. I kept my hands flat on the table because I did not want her to see them do anything else. And these. She placed the last set down 3 separate expense reports, each labeled Client Appreciation Event, each with a catering invoice attached. The first, $21,000. The second, $19,000. The third, $27,000. The guest lists for all 3 of these events are in the back. I pulled them from his email when he left his account open on the home computer. She met my eyes steadily. 40% of the guests at each event were personal friends or family. Richard attended all 3. I attended one and spent the entire evening explaining to people that yes, Jason and I were still married. I picked up the expense reports and read through them carefully. The total across all 3, $67,000. Combined with the Audi and the country club, $183,000 over 24 months, drawn from the operating account of a company that was now claiming it needed to borrow $2.4 million to expand because its current cash flow was insufficient. Emily. I set the papers down carefully. Did you know he was doing this while it was happening? She did not flinch from the question. I knew some of it. I didn't know the amounts until I started pulling documents. She pressed her lips together. I told myself there was probably an explanation. That's what you do when someone controls everything, and you've been trained to give them the benefit of the doubt. Her voice tightened on the last sentence. I stopped doing that in April. No good, I said. April was the right time to stop. She gathered the papers back into a neat stack and pushed them across the table toward me. I want you to have these. I don't want you to use them to destroy him, Dad. Sophie loves her father. Whatever he's done, I don't want Sophie growing up watching her parents try to burn each other down. Her eyes held mine. But I need someone I trust to have the full picture. In case it matters later. I put my hand on the stack of papers. I'll give them to Martin. He'll know what needs to be kept and what needs to be documented properly. Emily nodded. Something in her shoulders released not completely, but enough that she looked like she was breathing easier than she had since she walked in. I called Martin after she left. I told him about the documents without reading specifics over the phone. He listened without interrupting, which was his way of telling me the information was landing the way serious information does not with drama, but with weight. Walt, he said when I finished. What Greg Patton suggested yesterday about the numbers not matching the image, he was not exaggerating. No, I said. He wasn't. Martin exhaled slowly. I'll set up a file. Keep everything dated and documented in case it becomes relevant to any future proceedings. He paused. And Walt, tonight Richard called me again. My hand tightened on the phone. What did he want this time? He wasn't threatening, Martin said, and his voice had shifted into the register he used when something had genuinely surprised him. He was asking questions about the partnership agreement, specifically about Jason's personal liability exposure if the expansion loan defaults. Another pause. Walt, why would Richard be asking about Jason's liability and not his own? I looked at the manila envelope on my kitchen table. That's exactly what I've been sitting here wondering, I said. By the third morning after Christmas, the holiday decorations on my street had started to look less like celebration and more like things nobody had gotten around to putting away yet. I was on my second cup of coffee when Martin called at 8:47. He did not open with pleasantries. He never did when the information was significant. Walt, I need to tell you what I've found out about Richard's phone calls yesterday. I spoke with a colleague last night, someone who handles small business contracts in Columbus. He told me Richard Carter contacted him 2 days ago, the day after Christmas. I set my mug down. Go ahead. Richard wanted advice on how to separate his legal liability from the decisions made during the expansion planning process. Martin's voice was careful and precise. Specifically, he wanted to know whether his role as senior advisor could be legally distinguished from Jason's role as CEO in terms of who bears responsibility if the expansion loan defaults and the bank pursues recovery. I sat with that for a moment. The furnace kicked on. Outside the window, the street was gray and still. Richard signed documents, I said. During the expansion application. So he did, Martin confirmed. I pulled what I could access. Richard signed 2 lease pre-agreements for the Dublin and Hilliard locations as company officer. That's his title on both documents, company officer, not advisor, not consultant. Company officer. Martin paused. The problem for Richard is that those signatures expose him to liability if the company defaults on obligations tied to those leases. He's not just a bystander, Walt. He's a signatory. And now he's trying to rewrite what he is, I said. He's trying to build a paper trail that describes him as a non-executive advisor with no real decision-making authority. He wants documentation that says the expansion was Jason's idea, Jason's plan, and Jason's call. Martin's voice tightened slightly. The documents he signed say otherwise. But if he can create enough ambiguity, emails, memos, anything dated before the crisis, he might be able to muddy the picture enough to protect himself. I thought about Jason sitting in his glass-walled office, believing his father had saved the company 6 years ago. Believing Richard had stood behind him because family stood behind each other. I thought about Richard at that Christmas table, chest out, glass raised, accepting credit for things he had not done, and preparing in the same motion to avoid credit for the things he had. "Does Jason know?" I asked. "My contact believes not yet," Martin said. "Richard has been careful. He's working through a lawyer. Jason doesn't know." My chest ached, not for Jason exactly, but for the particular ugliness of watching a man discover that the person he most admired has been calculating the distance between them for years. "Martin," I said. "When Jason finds out, it will be bad," Martin said simply. "Yes." I stood up and walked to the back door, looking out at the frozen garden. I thought about Sophie, 8 years old, living inside a house where 2 men were building cases against each other, while her mother quietly opened a bank account at Huntington, and her grandfather sat in his kitchen, figuring out where the edges of his responsibility actually were. "I want to ask you something," I said. "Honestly. When have I ever been anything else? Am I doing the right thing?" The question came out plainly, without decoration. Not pulling the investment, not pushing for full collapse. Drawing the line where I drew it, is that right? Or is it just what lets me sleep? Martin took a moment before answering, which was why I trusted him. He never answered that kind of question fast. "You're not using your position to destroy a business out of anger," he said. "You're letting the consequences of bad decisions land on the people who made them without manufacturing additional consequences." He paused. "That sounds right to me, Walt. It sounds like the way you've always operated." "And if it isn't enough?" I asked. "If Jason and Richard keep pushing, keep telling people I'm the problem, then people will look at the evidence and decide for themselves," Martin said. "You can't control what gets said about you. You can only control what you actually do." A pause. "Call Emily. Make sure she's all right." I called her after we hung up. She answered on the first ring. "Dad." Her voice was steadier than it had been the morning before, still tired, still carrying weight, but steadier. "I'm okay. Sophie's asking about coming to see you this weekend." Something warm moved through my chest so fast, it almost caught me off guard. "Tell her yes," I said. "Tell her we'll check on the garden." "There's nothing in the garden, Dad. It's December." "I know," I said, "but she doesn't need to know that until she gets here." Emily made a sound that was almost a laugh, a short, tired, genuine sound that I had not heard from her in longer than I could calculate. I held on to it after we hung up, the way you hold on to something small and warm on a cold morning, when you need to remember that warmth is still a thing that exists. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I answered. "Walt." The voice was Jason's, flat, controlled, with the particular tension of someone who had spent the last hour deciding to make a call they were not sure about. "I think we need to sit down. Just the 2 of us." I looked out the kitchen window at the empty garden. "About what?" "About fixing this," Jason said. I put the phone on the table without ending the call and looked at it for a long moment. Then I picked it back up. "When?" I asked. Jason said, "Whenever you're ready." I was not ready. I was not sure I would be. But I gave him a day anyway, because 43 people were still going to work every morning, and I had not yet run out of reasons to keep trying. Martin's office hadn't changed in 20 years. Same dark wood desk, with the same scratch along the left edge from the time we had moved it ourselves, instead of waiting for the building's maintenance crew. Same framed photograph above the bookcase, the two of us at a fishing lake in Michigan, the summer after I sold Hayes Supply. Both of us squinting against the sun, both of us looking like men who had recently put something heavy down. Same smell of old paper and strong coffee that I had always associated with the most honest conversations of my adult life. He had cleared the desk. That was new. Martin's desk was never clear. It was a working surface covered in the organized chaos of a man who processed information on paper and trusted his own filing system more than any digital alternative. The fact that he had cleared it told me he wanted space to spread things out, which meant he had already pulled documents and was ready to show me something specific. I sat down across from him. He poured 2 coffees without asking and pushed one toward me. "I want to show you the real picture," he said. "Not the picture Jason has been selling. The actual state of that company as of this morning." "Show me," I said. He laid the documents out in 3 rows. Not the stolen bank statements from Emily's envelope, those he had filed separately, properly dated and documented. These were public records, annual filings with the Ohio Secretary of State, commercial lease registrations, and the comparative financial summaries Martin could access as the registered agent for our silent partnership. He walked me through it methodically, the way he had walked me through Hayes Supply's quarterly reports for 15 years. No drama, no emphasis, just numbers and what they meant. The current picture, Carter Home Furnishings, had 4 operating locations. 2 were consistently above their break-even point. 2 were not. The Gahanna location had been running below break-even for 14 months, and the Easton area location had been subsidized by transfers from the stronger stores for the better part of a year. The inventory turnover ratio, the same metric Walter had raised at Christmas dinner before Jason laughed him off, was sitting at 2.3 turns per year for the underperforming locations. A healthy furniture retailer ran at 4 to 6. "He's been carrying dead weight for over a year," I said. "And accelerating into it," Martin confirmed. The expansion plan would have added 3 new locations before the existing problem locations were stabilized. The $2.4 million loan would have been servicing new lease obligations while the current underperformers continued draining cash. He tapped the relevant column. "Walt, this is not a growth strategy. This is a man who believed that opening more doors would fix the problems behind the existing ones." My jaw tightened. I had seen that pattern before in my industry in competitors who had overreached and not made it back. It was a particular kind of business failure that felt like ambition from the inside and looked like recklessness from the outside. "The original investment," I said. "Where does the company stand with that?" "Your equity stake is intact. The company has not defaulted on anything tied to the original partnership structure." Martin folded his hands on the desk. "Walt, the company will not collapse without the expansion loan. It will contract. Jason will be forced to make decisions he has been avoiding, closing the underperforming locations, liquidating excess inventory, renegotiating vendor terms. It will be painful and public, and it will damage the image he has spent 6 years building." He looked at me steadily. "But the people on his payroll will still have jobs through the contraction, assuming he manages it responsibly. And if he doesn't manage it responsibly, then 28 or 30 of them might." That's the number I needed to hear," I said. Martin picked up his coffee. "What are you going to say to Jason when you meet him?" I looked at the documents spread across the desk. The real numbers, the ones that had been sitting behind the press releases, and the country club dinners, and the Christmas presentation, patient and indifferent, waiting to be read by someone who knew how. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I know what I'm not going to say." "What's that?" "Yes," I said. Martin nodded. He began stacking the documents back into their folder. There's one more thing. I went back through the pre-lease agreements Richard signed for the Dublin and Hilliard locations. He did not look up from the papers. On both documents, Richard signed as company officer. But in the correspondence he sent to my colleague last week, the lawyer he's been consulting, he described himself as a non-executive advisor with no signing authority. He set the folder down and looked at me. 2 sets of documents, directly contradictory, both dated, both on file. The implication settled into the room. When Jason finds those, I said. He will find them, Martin said. It's only a matter of when. I drove home from Martin's office in the early afternoon. Gray past the holiday traffic and the after-Christmas sales signs and the familiar intersections of a city I had lived in long enough to know by feel. My phone buzzed on his passenger seat. A text from Emily. Walt, Jason just told me you agreed to meet him tomorrow. He's acting like everything is already settled. I don't know what he's planning, but something feels wrong. I typed back with one hand at a red light. Nothing is settled. I put the phone down and drove the rest of the way home thinking about the particular confidence of a man who believed an apology and a signed document were the same thing. Jason had chosen his own office for the meeting. That choice told me everything I needed to know about how he expected the conversation to go. His territory, his desk, his framed business licenses on the wall behind him, all of it arranged to remind whoever sat across from him that they were on his ground and that he controlled what happened here. I arrived at 9 o'clock and did not comment on the office. I sat in the chair he indicated, a leather guest chair lower than his, which was a choice I had seen made in conference rooms before, and always noted, and I looked at my son-in-law across the width of his mahogany desk, and waited. Jason was dressed carefully. Pressed shirt, no jacket, casual enough to suggest this was a conversation between family, formal enough to signal that he had prepared. He looked tired around the eyes, which was the first genuine thing about his appearance. Whatever sleep he had managed in the last 6 days, it had not been restful. I appreciate you coming, he said. You asked me to, I said. I came. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back up at me. Walt, I want to talk about what happened at Christmas, and I want to talk about where we go from here. Go ahead, I said. He stood up from his desk. I watched him walk around it, a deliberate movement, closing the physical distance that a desk creates between people who are negotiating, and he stopped in front of me. He looked at me for a beat. Then he went down on one knee. My first thought before anything else was that he had practiced this. Not necessarily in front of a mirror, but in his head, the staging of it, the visual weight of it, the way it would feel to the person watching. Jason Carter had always been fluent in presentation. I'm sorry, Walt, he said. His voice was low-controlled, carrying the shape of sincerity without quite filling it. For what happened at Christmas. I lost my temper and I said things I shouldn't have. I looked down at him, kneeling on the carpet of his own office in front of his own desk, beneath his own framed licenses and his own window looking out over his own parking lot. My chest did not soften the way he was hoping it would. My jaw did not unclench. I felt something instead that I had not expected, a kind of tired clarity, the feeling of seeing a thing exactly as it was, without the distortion of wanting it to be something else. He stood back up, walked behind the desk, opened the center drawer, and took out a single sheet of paper folded in thirds and placed it on the desk in front of me. I had this prepared, he said, just to make things easier going forward. I reached out and picked it up. I unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something when you already know what it is, and you want to be sure you are reading it correctly before you respond. It was a formal written request, to restore the loan guarantee on the $2.4 million expansion loan. There was already a signature line for me already dated, already notarized in anticipation. He had brought this document to this meeting before I had agreed to come. He had written the date of today's meeting on the notarization line before I had walked through the door. I read it twice. Then I folded it along its original creases and placed it back on the desk between us. I did not slide it toward him. I did not push it away. I simply set it down in the space between us and looked at him. "You prepared this before you called me," I said. Not a question. Jason's jaw tightened. A muscle moved along his cheekbone, the involuntary tell of a man whose prepared answer has been bypassed by the wrong question. "Walt, I just wanted to be efficient." "Jason." I said his name quietly, the way I had learned to say things that needed to be heard rather than shouted. "The day you can sit in a room and tell me not what you overreacted to, not what got out of hand, not what the pressure of the season caused, but what you actually did to me at that table, and what your father did, and what my daughter said while it was happening." I stood up and reached for my coat on the back of the chair. "That's the day we'll have a real conversation." His face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, then the reflexive start of an argument, then something that looked briefly like shame. The shame lasted maybe 2 seconds before the armor came back up. "Walt, I'm going to see myself out," I said. "I know the way." I walked through the showroom floor on the way to the exit, past the display sofas and the bedroom sets and the dining room tables arranged in artificial domestic scenes, all of it lit by the kind of bright commercial lighting that makes everything look slightly more permanent than it is. Near the front door, one of the salespeople recognized me and raised a hand in greeting. I nodded back. Outside, the December air was sharp and immediate. I walked to my truck and got in and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the Carter Home Furnishings sign above the entrance. My phone buzzed. Emily. Her voice was different from every previous call this week, not shaking, not careful, not carrying the weight of someone managing their own fear. She sounded like someone who had made a decision. "Dad, can you come to the house tonight? Bring Martin if you can. I have something everyone needs to see." My hand tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "Just come," she said. "Please." Emily opened the door before I had fully cut the engine. She had been watching for my headlights from the front window. I could see the curtain still moving as I came up the porch steps. Martin was a half step behind me, his breath fogging in the December cold, his portfolio tucked under one arm out of professional habit, even though she had not told either of us why we were coming. "Thank you for getting here fast," Emily said. She stepped back to let us in, and I noticed immediately that Jason's Audi was not in the driveway. She noticed me noticing. "He's meeting with his lawyer. He doesn't know you're here." I stepped inside. The house felt different from every other time I had stood in this entryway, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise level. The Christmas tree in the living room was still lit, throwing colored light across the ceiling in slow pulses, and beneath it on the rug sat Sophie in her pajamas, cross-legged, an iPad in her lap, looking up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not the bright, uncomplicated joy she usually aimed at me when I walked through a door. Something older. Something that understood, even at 8 years old, that what was about to happen in this room was important. "Grandpa Walt," she said. Her voice was careful. "I have to show you something." I didn't know it was going to be a big deal when I took it. I crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside her. Not on the couch, not in a chair. On the floor at her level, the way I had sat with her since she was old enough to have a floor-level opinion about things. Martin sat on the edge of the couch behind us. Emily stood near the doorway with her arms folded across her chest and her jaw set. "Tell me about it," I said to Sophie. She looked down at the iPad in her hands. "On Christmas, when everybody was at Grandpa Richard's house, I was bored during the dinner part. Mom gave me the iPad to use in the corner so I wouldn't bother anyone." She picked at the edge of the iPad case with her thumbnail, a nervous gesture inherited from Emily. "I was taking a video because I thought it was going to be a fun Christmas, and I wanted to remember it. Like how Mom takes videos of birthday parties." She looked up at me. Her brown eyes were very steady for a child who was confessing something. "But then people started being loud, and I got scared, so I stopped. And I forgot about it." "When did you find it again?" I asked. "Yesterday. I was looking at old videos to show my friend, and it was just there." She swallowed. "I watched it. And then I showed Mom." Emily's voice came from the doorway, tight and controlled. "I found her watching it alone in her room. She didn't understand everything she was seeing. She just knew something bad had happened to you, and she wanted someone to explain it." I looked at my granddaughter. This child, who had been sitting in the corner of Richard's dining room with an iPad on Christmas night, trying to make a happy memory of a dinner that was already burning down around her. "Can I see it?" I asked. Sophie held the iPad out with both hands, the way children offer things they consider precious and breakable. I pressed play. The footage was slightly shaky, the angle of a child holding a tablet at chest height, not quite knowing where to point it. But the audio was clear. The dining room acoustics had done the rest. I watched Richard shake my hand and wipe his palm on the napkin. I watched myself sit in the chair without a cushion and not say a word about it. I watched Jason stand up at the head of the table with his wine glass and his pressed shirt and his confidence. And I heard my own voice asking about debt service coverage, and I heard the laugh that went around the table. And I heard Jason say clearly, unmistakably, in his own voice, "My father-in-law just Googled some business terms, and now he's an expert." I heard Richard say what he said about the most successful thing I had ever done. I watched the wine leave the glass. Martin made a sound behind me, a short, involuntary intake of breath, and then he was very careful not to make another sound. I watched Richard pick up the bread. I watched what he did with it. I watched it hit my face on a 2-second delay from the audio crack of it landing, and I watched myself reach for the napkin with hands that were steadier on screen than they had felt from the inside. And then I heard Emily's voice, close to the microphone because she had walked toward where Sophie was sitting when she came to me. Every word completely clear. "Dad, please. Sophie is watching. Just go. Don't ruin Christmas." I watched myself stand up. I watched Jason say something to Richard that the camera caught the shape of, but not the full sound. And then I heard Richard's response, and I heard Jason say clearly enough, "Finally." The footage ended there. Sophie had stopped recording when the voices got louder, and she had been frightened. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I handed the iPad back to Sophie. My hands were not shaking, but there was a warmth behind my eyes that I was working to keep in place. I looked at her small, serious face, and I thought about what it had cost an 8-year-old girl to sit alone in her bedroom and watch that video and then carry it to her mother. "Sophie," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "You did exactly the right thing showing this to your mom." Her chin trembled once fast. "Is Grandpa Richard going to be in trouble?" I put my hand on top of hers, covering the iPad. "That's for the grown-ups to figure out. Your job was to tell the truth, and you did it. That's enough." Martin cleared his throat behind me. When I turned, his expression was the careful, neutral face of a man who was processing significant information and had not yet decided what to do with all of it. He looked at Emily. Do you have a copy of this stored somewhere besides Sophie's camera roll? Emily straightened. I airdropped it to my phone and emailed it to myself from the library computer this morning. She met Martin's eyes. I also sent it to my lawyer. Martin nodded slowly. Good. That was exactly right. Emily looked at me. Something in her face shifted the held breath quality of a woman who had been waiting for permission to exhale and had just realized no one else was in charge of whether she breathed. That's not all I wanted to show you, Dad. She walked into the bedroom hallway and came back carrying a canvas tote bag, the kind she used for farmers market groceries. She set it on the coffee table. It landed with the heavy, papery sound of the bag full of documents. I made copies of everything. Every statement, every transfer, every expense report. 8 months. Martin looked at the bag. Then he looked at Emily with an expression I had only seen on his face a few times in 40 years, genuine surprise. Emily, do you understand what you're handing over? Emily Carter looked at Martin Cole with dry eyes and a steady jaw and said, yes. I do. Martin lifted the canvas bag from the coffee table and set it beside him on the couch without opening it. It was the careful, deliberate movement of a man who understood that what was inside carried weight beyond its physical mass, and that weight deserved to be handled correctly. He looked at Emily standing in the center of her own living room and said, before I look at any of this, tell me what you want to happen. Emily pulled in a breath that expanded her whole chest. I want my daughter to grow up in a house where nobody pours wine on her grandfather and calls it a bad night. Her voice did not shake, not even slightly. That's what I want. Martin nodded once. Then let's talk about how to get there. Sophie was still on the floor, watching the adults with the attentive stillness of a child who knows she is being permitted to witness something usually kept from children, and is trying very hard not to do anything that might revoke that permission. Emily glanced at her daughter, then at me. Soph. Emily said, can you go pick out your overnight bag? We're going to stay at Grandpa Walt's tonight. Sophie scrambled to her feet so fast, the iPad slid off her lap, and she had to lunge sideways to catch it. Can I bring my dinosaur? Yes, baby, Emily said. And your good pillow. Sophie disappeared down the hallway with her feet thudding against the hardwood gone before Emily finished the sentence, executing her mission with the total commitment only an 8-year-old can bring to packing an overnight bag. Emily watched her go. For one unguarded moment, her face did what it had been holding back all evening. Her eyes went bright and her lips pressed together hard, and she breathed through her nose 3 times in quick succession before she pulled it back under control. Then she turned to me. I opened the Huntington account 8 months ago, she said. Same time I started pulling the documents. Small amounts, things Jason didn't track closely. Grocery overages, birthday money from my aunt, a school refund I redirected before it hit the joint account. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs. I have enough for 90 days. Rent somewhere modest, Sophie's school food. 90 days to figure out the next part. And the lawyer, I asked. Catherine Briggs, family law, Upper Arlington practice. I've met with her twice. Emily's chin lifted slightly on the name, the quiet pride of someone who has done a hard adult thing without anyone's help and is not quite ready to stop being proud of it. I haven't filed anything yet, but I know what I'm entitled to, and I know what Jason's threat about the co-signer document is actually worth in an Ohio family court. A pause. Catherine says it's worth considerably less than he told me it was. Martin looked up from the bag. Jason threatened you with the lease co-signer document in a custody context. He said he would argue financial recklessness. Emily's jaw tightened. That I had entered commercial agreements without his knowledge or consent, and that no judge would award primary custody to a mother who signed business documents behind her husband's back. She held Martin's gaze steadily. Catherine says co-signing a lease even without a spouse's explicit consent does not constitute financial recklessness under Ohio family law, particularly when the signature was made in good faith to support a family business. She also says that if we document the financial control pattern, the allowance structure, the restricted account access, all of it, that changes the custody picture significantly in my favor. My throat tightened around something fierce and proud that I did not have an adequate word for. This woman had spent 6 years being told what she could and could not do with money that was partly hers. She had spent 4 years living under a threat that turned out to be partly hollow. And she had spent 8 months quietly, methodically in grocery overages and library computers and redirected school refunds, building the case that dismantled it. She had done all of it without asking me for a single dollar or a single word of advice. And Emily, I said. My voice came out lower than I intended. I'm proud of you. She blinked fast. One tear broke through before she pressed the back of her hand hard against her cheekbone. Don't do that right now, she said, her voice catching on the last word. If you're kind to me right now, I'm going to cry for 20 minutes, and I need to keep it together until Sophie's asleep. Fair enough, I said, and I meant it. Sophie reappeared from the hallway, dragging a rolling overnight bag that was slightly too large for a one-night trip, a stuffed brachiosaurus jammed under one arm, her coat on, and buttoned incorrectly by exactly one button, her shoes on the right feet. She planted herself in the middle of the living room and announced with complete authority, I'm ready. Martin stood. Emily picked up her own bag already packed, already waiting by the bedroom door, which told me she had made this decision before I arrived, and was simply glad not to be executing it alone. We were moving toward the front door when headlights swept across the living room window. Jason's car swung into the driveway. He came through the front door and stopped. His eyes moved across the room in one fast sweep, overnight bags, Martin with the canvas tote, Sophie in her coat, Emily standing with her bag in her hand. His face tightened. What is going on? The control in his voice was costing him something. I could hear the price of it. Emily turned to face her husband. She did not step back. She did not look at me for support or reassurance or permission. She stood in the center of her own living room in her coat bag in hand and looked at Jason Carter with the eyes of a woman who had finished being afraid of the specific thing he represented. Sophie and I are staying at Dad's for a while. She reached into her coat pocket and set a folded piece of paper on the end table beside the door. Those are my conditions if you want to have a conversation about what comes next. Read them when you're ready. Jason's gaze dropped to the paper, then to me. His expression moved through something complicated: anger first, then calculation, then underneath both of them for just a fraction of a second. Something that looked like the first faint recognition of what he had actually done to get here. Walt, he started. Good night, Jason, I said. I put my hand on Sophie's shoulder, and we walked out into the cold New Year's Eve air. Behind us, I heard Jason pick up the piece of paper. I heard the sound of it unfolding. I kept walking. We were almost to my truck when my phone rang. Not Emily, not Martin, who was right behind me loading the canvas bag into his own car. The screen said, Richard Carter. He called twice more before I reached the driver's side door. The persistence of it, 3 calls in under 90 seconds, told me something had broken open on his end of things. Something that could not wait and could not be managed through a lawyer or a carefully worded message. On the 3rd call, I answered. Richard, I said. His voice came through stripped of everything I had ever heard in it. The authority, the contempt, the performance of a man who had long ago decided He was the most important person in any room he entered. What was left underneath all of that was something much simpler and much older. Just a man calling on New Year's Eve because he had run out of other places to turn. Walt. A pause that carried real weight. We need to talk. Not about the money. His voice dropped further. About Jason. Richard Carter showed up at my door on New Year's morning without a coat. The porch thermometer read 26 degrees. He was standing in a dress shirt, arms at his sides, jaw set, in the way of a man who has spent all his pride just getting to someone's front door and has none left for what comes after. I pushed the door open. "Come in before you freeze." He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Emily had cried, where Martin had spread documents, where I had read my daughter's signature on a lease I was never supposed to see. I set a mug of coffee in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it like a man who had been cold for longer than the walk from his car. I sat across from him and waited. "So Jason found the emails last night," Richard said. His voice was rough at the edges. "The correspondence with the lawyer, about separating my liability from his." He stared into the coffee. "He read all of it." "How bad?" I asked. Richard made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "He said things I didn't know my son knew how to say. I said things back I can't take back." His knuckles went pale around the mug. I pushed him toward that expansion because I wanted to watch him build something bigger than what I'd done. Instead, I was signing documents as company officer and then telling lawyers I was just an advisor. His voice cracked on the last word, and he pulled it back with visible effort. "Because I was scared of my name being on a failure, and the dinner," I said quietly. Richard did not flinch. "I knew who you were when I threw that bread, Walt. I knew exactly what you had done for my son's company." He looked at his hands. "And I did it anyway. Because you made him look at me differently for 1 minute at that table. And I couldn't stand it." My throat tightened around something slow and heavy, not rage, but the particular grief of a thing confirmed that you had hoped might still be wrong. Richard." He looked up. "I accepted your apology the moment you walked through that door without asking me for anything." His jaw loosened. His eyes went very bright. He pressed one fist against his mouth and held it there, breathing hard through his nose. He was not going to cry, but it was close enough that it told me everything about what the night had cost him. "I'm going to withdraw the liability separation request," he said when he had it back. "Whatever my name is on my name stays on." He stood. "And I'm going to stay out of that company for the first time in 6 years." I walked him to the door. He stepped out into the cold New Year's morning without looking back. Sophie appeared behind me in the hallway, dinosaur under her arm, bare feet on the cold floor. She watched Richard's car disappear around the corner. "Is Grandpa Richard okay?" she asked. I put my arm around her small shoulders. "I don't know yet, Soph," I said honestly. "I don't know yet." Martin had cleared his desk again. Same scratch along the left edge, same fishing photograph on the wall, same smell of coffee and old paper that I had associated with serious conversations for 40 years. But this time there was a third chair pulled up to the desk, facing Martin, and me positioned with the particular deliberateness of a seat that has been placed rather than arrived at. Jason was already in it when I walked in. He stood when I entered, which surprised me. Not because standing was remarkable, but because Jason Carter had always been the kind of man who let other people come to him. The standing was small and deliberate and cost him something, and I noted it without commenting on it. I sat. Martin sat. Jason sat back down. He looked different from every other version of himself I had seen this week. Not the Christmas dinner performance. Not the scripted apology in his own office. He was wearing a regular shirt, no cufflinks, the kind of clothes a man puts on when he has stopped dressing for an audience and is just getting dressed. His eyes were tired in the specific way of someone who has spent several days looking at things they would have preferred not to see. "Thank you for coming," Jason said. He looked at me directly. "Both of you." "You asked," I said. "I came. Let's not make it more than it is." He accepted that without flinching, which was also new. "All right." He folded his hands on his desk. "Tell me what you need from me." I looked at him for a moment, this 41-year-old man who had built a version of himself out of borrowed money and other people's silence, and had worn it so long he had stopped being able to feel the difference between what was real and what was constructed. I thought about the 43 people who had gone to work this morning. I thought about Sophie asking about the garden in December, patient enough to believe something worth tending was still there under the frost. "I'm not going to restore the expansion guarantee," I said. "That's finished, and it stays finished. What I'm going to tell you is what I'm willing to do and what I need from you in return." Jason's jaw tightened. He nodded. "I have a wholesale contact," I said. "Furniture industry, been in business 30 years, moves volume. If I make an introduction, he can take a significant portion of your excess inventory at a fair price. Not full retail margin, but enough to give you operating cash to cover payroll for the next 2 months while you restructure." I paused. "Martin will work with your accounting team to set up transparent financial reporting going forward. Real numbers, not the version you've been presenting." Jason's throat moved. "And what do you need from me?" "The Audi goes back. This week." I watched his face. "The 2 underperforming locations, Gahanna and Easton, close by the end of January. You renegotiate your vendor terms yourself without me making calls on your behalf. And you go to the bank alone and work out the existing debt structure without my name attached to anything going forward. And that's—" Jason started, then stopped himself. He exhaled through his nose. "That's going to be public. People will know the expansion failed." "People already know," Martin said quietly. "The question is whether they find out you managed it or whether they watch it manage you." Jason looked at the desk. His hands had tightened on each other, the knuckles going slightly pale. "And Richard withdraws from every operational role," I said. "That's not negotiable, and it's not about punishment. The 2 sets of documents with his signatures directly contradicting each other are a legal liability sitting inside your company right now. You either deal with it, or it deals with you at a time of its choosing." Jason's jaw worked. "He's my father. He's a man who spent 6 years taking credit for something I did, and then spent last week preparing paperwork to make sure your name was on the consequences instead of his." I kept my voice level. "I'm not asking you to stop loving him, Jason. I'm asking you to stop letting him make decisions for a company that has your name on the door." The room held that for a long moment. Martin did not move. Jason stared at the surface of the desk, and I watched the calculation behind his eyes run its course. The pride, the resistance, the slow arithmetic of a man figuring out what things actually cost versus what he had been telling himself they cost. "If I do all of this," Jason said finally, his voice lower than it had been, "what do you get out of it?" 43 people keep their jobs," I said. "And you stop pretending the company is something it isn't." Jason looked at me for a long time. His eyes were steady and tired and carrying something that was not quite shame and not quite acceptance, but was somewhere between the two and moving slowly in the right direction. "And if I say no," Then you deal with the bank alone. The Westerville lease goes to market rate in March, and you figure out the rest without me. I leaned back in my chair. I'm not your enemy, Jason, but I'm not your safety net anymore either. He looked at Martin. Martin looked back at him with the patient, unhelpful expression of a man who has heard every version of this moment and knows that no one else can answer the question being asked. Jason looked back at me. I need a few days. You have until January 10th, I said. He stood. He reached across the desk and extended his hand. I shook it, a brief, firm handshake, nothing more. He walked to the door. Then he stopped, one hand on the frame, and turned back. Did you know, he said carefully, from the beginning that I knew it was you? I looked at him. No, he nodded slowly. I thought you did. I thought the whole thing was a test. Something moved across his face, grief maybe, or the specific regret of understanding that a story you have been telling yourself is not the story that was actually happening. I thought you were watching to see what I'd do with it. He stepped out. His footsteps crossed the reception area and the outer door opened and closed. Martin looked at me. Was that the truth? I turned to the window. The January sky outside was pale and still the kind of sky that makes no promises. Somewhere under the frost in my backyard, the soil was still there, still waiting. Which part? I said. I did not sleep the night before January 10th. I lay in the dark, listening to the furnace run, Emily and Sophie breathing quietly down the hall, and I made my peace with both answers, yes and no, somewhere around 2 in the morning. By the time I got up and made coffee, I was not nervous. I was just a man waiting for a phone to ring. Emily came downstairs at 8 and sat across from me without speaking, which was exactly right. She poured her coffee and we watched the pale January light come up over the backyard together, and that was enough. At 9:17, Jason called. I'll do it, he said. All of it. His voice carried the specific weight of a man who has made a decision he cannot walk back from. I called the bank yesterday. The Audi paperwork is signed. They pick it up Friday. Gahanna and Easton close end of January. And Dad... He stopped. I filed the removal paperwork yesterday. Richard is out of every operational role effective immediately. My hand tightened on the phone. How did he take it? He said I was choosing my father-in-law over my own father. A long breath. I told him I was choosing the truth. Something moved through my chest that was not triumph, just the quiet feeling of a thing landing where it was always going to land. A Walt. His voice dropped lower. There's something else. Something I have to tell you before you hear it from anyone else. He paused. 4 years ago, when I figured out you were the investor, I hired investigators. I wanted to know your full financial picture, what you actually had, whether there was more. He stopped. I never used the report, but I had it. I burned it last night. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window. The tomato cages stood bare in the January frost. I thank you for telling me, I said. My voice came out even. Burn the report. Already did, he said. Last night. After I hung up, I called Martin. He said yes. Martin said good. Then, what do you want now, Walt? I looked out at the frozen garden. I want to find out if there's anything left worth building, I said. Christmas came around again, the way it always does, without asking permission, without waiting for anyone to be ready. I drove to Emily's apartment in Dublin on Christmas afternoon, with wine, sweet potato casserole, and no certainty about what kind of evening was waiting. Sophie hit me at full speed, before I cleared the doorway and pulled me toward her paper chain decorations, slightly lopsided and completely proud of themselves. Martin arrived behind me with a bakery pie. Jason knocked on the door and waited. He always knocked, now always waited, and came in looking like a man who had stopped dressing for an audience and was just getting dressed. Carter Home Furnishings had 2 locations, 31 employees, and financial statements that said what they meant. The Audi was gone. The country club membership had been canceled in February. Richard had not been invited, and he did not call. Halfway through dinner, Jason set his fork down and looked at me. "Walt." His voice was uneven in the way of words chosen in real time rather than rehearsed. "You didn't destroy my business. You stopped hiding the parts of it I was too afraid to look at." His jaw tightened once and released. "I built 6 years on a foundation I didn't build, and when it shifted, I blamed the man who laid it." I wanted to say that out loud, in front of people who were there. Sophie put her hand over mine, the same small gesture she had made 13 months ago at Richard's table when she was 8 years old, and did not understand what was wrong, but knew that something was. "I hear you, Jason," I said. "Not I forgive you. Not we're fine. Just I hear you." And this time that was the truest thing I had, and it was enough. Later, Emily stood beside me at the window. "Richard called me last week," she said quietly. "Are you going to call him back?" I watched the Christmas lights on the Dublin street. "I don't know yet," I said. She nodded. She understood that was not a no. Sophie came out of the kitchen and leaned against my arm. "Can we grow tomatoes at your house next summer, Grandpa Walt?" I pulled her close. "Yeah, Soph. We can do that." I drove home that night in the 2009 pickup, through familiar Columbus streets, the radio playing something low and old that Margaret had liked. I was not pretending everything was fixed. I was just a 68-year-old man driving home from Christmas dinner, grateful for what was real. The spare key to Emily's apartment was on my key ring. She had handed it to me in March without ceremony. "Just here, Dad, in case I lock myself out." Nobody else had one. That was not the point anymore. The point was that I had not had to ask for it. And that made all the difference. I have thought about that Christmas dinner every day since it happened. Not with anger anymore. Anger is a fire that burns what it touches, including the person carrying it. What I think about now is what I should have done differently long before that night. I let things go too long. I told myself it was patience. It was not patience, it was fear dressed up in a quiet man's clothing. Fear of losing Emily. Fear of breaking something I loved by insisting it be honest. If I could go back, I would say this to any father listening: do not wait for someone to pour wine on your shirt before you decide your dignity is worth protecting. You teach people how to treat you. Teach them early and teach them clearly. I also learned, and I believe God puts certain moments in our lives, not to punish us, but to show us where we have been looking away, that silence is not the same as peace. I called my silence patience. My family called it permission. There is a difference, and it cost all of us years we cannot get back. Here is what I know now. Family drama revenge is never about winning. It is about finally telling the truth loudly enough that no one can pretend they did not hear it. The dignity I reclaimed that December was not revenge, it was just the bill coming due on years of borrowed silence. These are the moments that define what kind of family you actually are beneath the Christmas lights and the pressed shirts and the performance of it all. Real family stories' revenge is quiet. It looks like a man driving home in a 2009 pickup, grateful for what is real. And if you have ever sat at a table where you were made to feel small, I hope you find your way to that same quiet, Because the best family drama revenge is simply refusing to disappear. If this story touched something in, you drop a word in the comments. I read every single one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't yet, subscribing to Dad Family Revenge takes 1 second and means these stories find their way to people who need them most. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain fictional elements, crafted with the sole purpose of entertaining and inspiring reflection. If this type of content is not for you, we completely respect that. Feel free to step away and find what speaks to you best. But if you stay, we promise to make it worth your time.